Okay, greetings everyone. I want to welcome you, those who are directly in the session with us and those who will be watching this recorded. I want to thank you for joining us. Start off with introductions. My name is Kali Akuno. I'm representing the Institute for Social Ecology. Many of you also know me with my work with Cooperation Jackson, based in Jackson, Mississippi. But today, I'm proud to present the fifth installment of a series that we've been doing now in the spring and summer about the revolution and the counter-revolution in the Sudan and really the broader now East Africa region, really, as I think everybody's been listening to the conversation and its global impact, of which it definitely has one. And so this is part 2 of our series about Abyei, which is a region, an autonomous region, which is nestled between Sudan and South Sudan. If you missed the first part of that series, I would definitely encourage you to go back and look at it on the ISC YouTube page, and we'll put a link both in the video once it's aired and put a link to that one in this particular chat for folks who may not have been able to witness it. So the first part, we really talked about the history and background of how Abyei became kind of a special region, special zone, and is still struggling for its own democratic rights of expression of self-determination. And that can play itself out in a number of different ways. So folks are clear, either becoming part of Sudan or becoming part of South Sudan or becoming its own independent country. So there's a lot of options and what self-determination could mean. So, and I'm happy to bring back Brother Daniel Dean, to share with us directly, direct experience about both this history and the kind of concurrent situation and developments kind of as they are unfolding and all their complexity. Today, we really want to get into this session, really want to get into the kind of economic underpinnings of Abyei and the situation it's in. So I just want to dive into it because the last time, we could have talked for about 2 or 3 hours and still not exhausted the subject. So don't want to waste a lot of time. But I do want to start, Danny, before we get into that, just to ask, just for the record, what are your preliminary thoughts on President Joe Biden's final comments to the UN General Assembly, which he offered yesterday, and as they relate to this ongoing conflict in the Sudan? He made a pledge, or let me not phrase it, not a pledge. A pledge would mean he's actually doing something or offering something. He made a statement demanding and encouraging all the different international forces and states that are arming the different factions, that being the Army and RSF, to stop arming them to end the conflict in the Sudan. I find there to be some irony there. I'll leave my opinion for later, but I want to get your take on these statements and what you think their impact might be to get us started off today, Daniel.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you. Glad to be back. Definitely, you're right. Abyei is a complex issue, nested within a bunch of other complex issues in a complex region and an increasingly complex world. So I hope I can help make a little bit of sense out of things over the course of the next hour. But in terms of your question, definitely folks are arming both sides. There's a lot of international involvement in support of the two different sides for all types of reasons. And it does escalate the level of violence. It does create a situation where it probably does appear to be more of a zero-sum game than it has to be. And it probably does take us further away from peace. That having been said, if you did stop the flow of arms to folks, knowing Sudanese, right, and even South Sudanese as well, they'd still find a way to fight. Okay, so that's not going to solve the root of the problem. But I think the bigger reflection for me goes back to that old idiom which is be careful of pointing out the speck in someone else's eye when you got a plank in your own. And I think Biden needs to really reflect carefully on that statement of his in terms of his own responsibility to stop arming folks and to de-escalate conflict in the world. Because while we're talking about Abyei and Sudan, we're also at a moment of existential crisis for the whole world.
That's right.
We're closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. And the media is not talking about it as they should be, but it's because of the decision to allow the military-industrial complex to determine the foreign policy of the United States of America. I know that's a contentious and touchy statement to make, but I believe that that's true. And so that I hope Biden, for all of our sakes, internalizes his message, and takes it very seriously. But it won't stop the fighting in Sudan. Sudan needs a deeper solution.
Yeah. Well, I just thought the armor in chief making a statement like that was pretty ironic. And I saw one version of it, I think it was on First Post News, where they had like cameras, and they did a panel of some of the world leaders, and they all kind of like turned around and like, couldn't believe what they were hearing in light of, what they're doing in the Ukraine, what they're doing, arming Israel to the teeth, and allowing them to both blatantly just violate international law, and escalate, we can wax about that one all day. I just thought it was interesting, like on the one hand, it was encouraging that Sudan was even mentioned, because outside of, here in the U.S., there's been very little coverage, either of kind of the escalating famine, the deeper displacement that's going on, in the region. I think the last there was any major coverage was about some recent floods that just took place, right? And the how that was exacerbated by the ongoing civil war was not even mentioned on any of the major networks, let alone the United States government's a deep complicity in all of this. And it is an arms supplier to the states, the primary states, which are arming, the conflict. So it's not like it is not directly involved itself in so many fundamental ways. Okay. So I want to come back. So part two about Abyei. I think diving into the economy, and again, we touched on a little bit the first part of the series, which talked about how much oil was concentrated there and so many other natural resources. But if you can just give like a brief 2 or 3 minute recap, and then we can go in some granular detail on some of the particular issues that I think is important for an international audience to hear, and then to understand, how this economy in particular is working, and who's interested and who benefit, and then ultimately outline of a discussion of what a future could look like if the people are able to determine that for themselves how the economy should
work. Right. Okay, I think this is an opportunity for us to look at economy in practical terms, right? It's easy for us to, and probably useful at a certain point, to discuss economic theory or the various ideologies that frame debates around economics, around capitalism. But we can also take a very pragmatic look at what an economy is and how it functions in a particular place, and how it interacts with the conflict system, and then potentially how it could help serve the cause of peace and development. And so let's start with basically the natural resource base of Abyei, because economics is still a question of how we transform the energy from the sun as expressed through the air and the wind, the water and the soil and the minerals, how we turn that into goods and services that we want and need, basically, and distribute those things. So it starts with the natural resources. Abyei is endowed with significant natural resources. Let's start with those that are literally closest to the people. The first is the land itself. It's an area of fertile soils right on the southern edge of the expanding Sahara Desert. It's an area that is crisscrossed by rivers, tributaries of the Nile, and these rivers have a seasonal ebb and flow where they create pasture lands, grasslands. And that brings up the next thing, which is not only close to the people, but actually integral to the culture of the Nilotic people, especially, which is cattle. And it's a very cattle-rich area, as is the entire Sudan, South Sudan, East Africa in general. And these cattle are free-range cattle that move with the herders in search of seasonal pastures. Abyei, being a high ground and well-watered, is a meeting place for many communities who bring their cows and their cattle to pasture on the rain-fed lands of Abyei seasonally under customary agreement administered between the chiefs of Abyei, the Ngok Dinka, and the neighboring chiefs. And this is a system that's been going on for centuries, if not millennia. Okay. The next natural resource, which is very important and also very strategic and poorly understood, is the forest of gum Arabic trees, the acacia tree. Abyei is basically a huge forest of gum Arabic. Gum Arabic is a key ingredient in many different industrial sectors, especially in the West. Everything from confectionery to glass to health and beauty products to beverages, including Coca-Cola and all the soft drinks. Gum Arabic is a very strategic commodity internationally and one that is only sourced from several countries. Sudan, South Sudan, Chad, and Nigeria, I believe, account for at least 80% of the world's gum Arabic trade. Gum Arabic is in such high demand that when sanctions were put on the Sudan, gum was exempted. And I believe, this may be a little bit of an urban legend, but I believe I have good reason to say this, part of the reason was the lobby of Coca-Cola. You're not going to cut off our access to the gum. So that's another important and underutilized resource that is also in Abyei. The big one that people often think about is the oil. Abyei is an oil producing area. It's an area with significant oil reserves, much of which is still untapped, partly because of the conflict had prevented the advanced exploration further south. So the oil production has mainly been on the northern tip of Abyei, bordering the Misriya Black Arab communities that are the direct northern neighbor to the Ngok Dinka. And so the oil of Abyei is a significant factor in the economy. So that's a basic natural resource profile of Abyei. And I'm gonna let you kind of guide where you want to go with it in terms of how that plays itself out in terms of political economy.
Well, I think let's touch more, if you can, Daniel, on the gum Arabic, because that's the one I don't think most people in the United States would get. You know, the oil, we kind of know a lot of that story and that history. But if you can touch more on the gum Arabic and just give people, you know, I think to start, like, why is it so important? You know,
Yeah.
Because you know it's one of those kind of pieces that you know, I don't think people understand quite what it is, how it's grown, and then you know how it's used and employed. So if you could
Yeah.
break it down, I think that'll be a good start, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so gum Arabic is the common name given to a certain species, or I think there's a few different varieties of acacia tree, and it produces gum. We call it gum Arabic because that's kind of the historical branding of it. In fact, it's funny, there's also movements now in more recent times to rename it, at least the gum which comes from, you know, the purely African origin in terms of the continent and the communities, as gum Africa or gum Nubia even. But anyway, gum is a tree that when cut produces a sap, and that sap hardens and crystallizes into a product that is very useful across many different industries. And in addition to being medicinal, on top of it. And so gum, especially the beverage industry, the function of gum is to hold small particles in suspension so you don't get that residue at the bottom. That's one of the key functions of gum. And that's why you find it in such things as confectionaries, where chocolates and things like that, candies, you need a very smooth, even consistency across the product, the substance. The same being true of beverages. That's why you never see Coke having sediment at the bottom, or any of the soft drinks having sediment at the bottom. In health and beauty products, lotions, soaps, the full gamut of them, gum is there. Of course, there's chewing gum. When you eat natural chewing gum, you're using gum arabic as well. So literally, there's probably 7 to 10 large complexes of value chains that are fed by the gum, and thousands of products that flower and bloom from those value chains. And the extraction of it is very similar to most natural resources in Africa. Folks get it dirt cheap, and it's taken to Europe, where the value addition is done, and then it's sent all over the world. I think France is one of the big processors of gum arabic. And so the value to the local community is extremely limited, especially the Ngok Dinka, who are the resident population. They've never developed a local industry around the gum. So it remains as a significant area of potential and possibility.
Well, let me ask you a question on that. Has it been efforts denied, or have there been attempts to do any kind of processing of value-added production in the Sudan itself, or in Abyei itself? And if so,
yeah,
you know, why is it still being exported at this rate, and that there is no, local industrial transformation?
Yeah, great question. Sudan as a whole has understood the value of gum, and as a government, as a national government, has taken it very seriously. They established the Gum Arabic Company, which was a national company that had a monopoly on all gum production in Sudan. So literally up until the independence of South Sudan, you had no capacity to do anything in the industry except through that company that was basically run by the regime in Khartoum. And so that's one aspect of it. I would say that they did, as Sudan has always had very highly trained and highly skilled technical people in various sectors, especially before the kind of Islamic revolution. It was well known for exporting human resources to the Arab world, to all over the place. And so they did even upgrade gum arabic to a medicinal pharmaceutical product in terms of its international categorization, such that they could get more on the market for it. So that was quite a good thing. In terms of the gum that is south of the international border between the two countries now, where Abyei sits, really conflict has not only prevented the development of the gum sector, but almost all sectors. I mean, South Sudan is probably still among one of the most remote, infrastructure deficient places on earth. And the war in the South, the rebellion against the Northern government, actually started in 1955, a year before the independence of Sudan. And although there was a brief period of peace between 1972 and 1983, under what we call the Addis Ababa Agreement, essentially you had 50 years of continuous warfare in the South that precluded any real development from taking place, and where most of the human resources were either living in perpetual states of displacement and refuge, either within the country or outside, or they had picked up arms.
And one piece, when you were mentioning, just to get deeper into it, so the central government, the Khartoum government, you said it centralized it and created just one monopoly company.
Yes.
Did that monopoly, was it just primarily a kind of producers cartel, in that, like, were there individual land ownership or tenureship and people producing just had to sell it, to that particular company, monopoly, or were there like individual land ownership and producers? Like, how was that kind of mediated, and what, now that things
Structured.
have kind of fractured, how is that looking like in Abyei for any kind of future, development? Are there individual proprietorship, collective proprietorship, through various clans or tribes? Like, how is that broken down? And because that's going to factor into post-conflict, getting to that point, what is then inherited for folks to build upon that may either, facilitate more production and more equity or more conflict?
Got you. Got you. Great question. I see we're a little bit spotty on the internet connection. So if it continues, I'll switch access points. So just
Okay.
let me know. Let me know if you're getting me.
We're getting, your voice is coming through. The video is going in and out, but your voice is coming through, fine. That's not breaking up. Oh, and just as I said that, it stopped. Yeah, Daniel, I think you may need to switch over, because just as I said that, it looked like it stopped on us.
Okay, yeah, I just switched.
Okay.
So hopefully this will be better. So in terms of how the production is set up, right? And this could, I know what I know, and there's limits to my knowledge on this. So I'll speak to how it's occurred in Abyei. You have the Misriya, who are the Black Arabs that I mentioned, and that I'm saying that in a very purposeful way. We'd have to unpack, well, what do you mean by Black Arabs?
Right.
But
right.
let's just call them the Black Arabs that occupy the lands north of Abyei, a significant group. It's not a small tribal group. This is an extensive periphery of the North Sudanese core, which we call the Riverian core of Khartoum and other cities on the Nile. This is the Black Belt, they used to call it, nomadic Black cattle keeping Arabs. They have a long history of trade. And so culturally, they are oriented towards trade and they're good at it. Okay. And so they have understood the market making aspect, and they would come into Abyei and buy gum, produce gum, tap trees, and take it to the north. So in that sense, I think what you're talking about is a very distributed production base that finds its ways into a central channel, kind of like the way diamonds work in Congo, but even more centralized, because there you find resources going out in all different directions. But this is really a single channel, just because the gum sector itself is such an exclusive, unknown, and controlled market. Having said that, now with the disruptions in Sudan, everything is going to be renegotiated and redefined in the coming years, hopefully sooner than later. We pray for peace sooner than later. We pray that there is a reconfiguration of key sectors as the governance is established. And I think the question of how the gum is managed is a great one, and the possibility for cooperative production, organized production, value addition closer to the community level, is a huge opportunity for Sudan and South Sudan, and one that frankly people don't talk about much and aren't really aware of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think just being a little bit proactive, and putting a different kind of hat on, this is something I think where a critical intervention needs to be, made or thought through, because
Right,
eventually there will be some type of settlement,
right.
and what the terms are. But if, something going to facilitate equitable development in the country, this could be one of those key factors in that, and it's going to have to be a high level of unity, with forces on the ground to be able to then deal with international markets, effectively. So
Yeah.
Coca-Cola and forces like that you mentioned aren't able to then kind of set terms and set prices. So that's going to
Right.
be a critical piece. So that leads me to the big boy on the block, Daniel, which is the oil.
Yeah.
And how that particular piece is playing out in Abyei. Now, you spoke a little bit about that in the first session, right? And you had mentioned in particular kind of China's role, but we know they're not the only player on the scene. How is that playing out? In Abyei in the midst of all this, and how is this being mediated in the ongoing war, the ongoing kind of civil conflict that's been taking place in Abyei and South Sudan as well?
Yeah. When the comprehensive peace agreement was negotiated and concluded in 2005, leading to the 2011 independence of South Sudan by virtue of a referendum on self-determination, there were 5 protocols that framed the comprehensive peace agreement. The protocols were power sharing, which established a government of national unity during an interim period where they would try to work together between South and North to make unity attractive so that people would consensually vote to stay together. That didn't happen. There was also what they call the protocol on security arrangements, essentially how the army would function. Then there was the protocol on wealth sharing. And this is what spelled out how the oil sector would be managed between the two countries. There was, in addition, a protocol on Abyei and a protocol on 2 other areas, which are now firmly in Sudan, Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile, which are both in rebellion against the central government. So the protocol on wealth sharing created a division of the oil between North and South, between the 2 governments. And it was the Abyei protocol had its own reflection of the wealth sharing agreement, which said that the local community of Abyei, the Ngok Dinka, and interestingly, the language of the agreement framed it in tribal terms, that the Ngok Dinka are entitled to 2% of the revenues of the oil from Abyei, and that the Misriya Arabs to the north are also entitled to 2%, and then the 2 neighboring states are entitled to 2% each. One of those states is now in Sudan, and one of them in South Sudan, and the government of Sudan 50%, and the government of South Sudan 42%. So this was essentially a split that was supposed to happen with respect to the oil that was being pumped in Abyei. At that time, the oil of Abyei was very significant in terms of the overall production that was being shared. It was about 30% of the total, had accounted for 30% of the total production up until that time. And it was, the total production was about 650,000 barrels per day at that time of oil coming from the South. So essentially this is the pie that's being divided up. And I went into real explicit detail about how that was supposed to happen, just because that is such a fundamental factor in understanding the political economy of these countries, is the division of the pie between these elite stakeholders who are also military leaders who have armies behind them. And so what happened is that the people of Abyei and the Ngok Dinka have never received 1 penny of that 2%. Okay, if you go to Abyei, you won't even find a single building built with oil revenues. You won't see a road built with oil revenue. You'll see nothing. I would say it's probably the most extreme example of pure extraction with absolutely no accountability. Okay, the international community is there, right? There's a peacekeeping force there. Everyone knows what's going on, but no one has ever really raised the issue of this extreme violation of the rights of this community that are even enshrined in an international agreement. So that's the first thing is, yeah.
Before you go further, so baby come back. So the 2% was supposed to be distributed by whom?
Good question. The 2% was supposed to be during the Abyei Protocol, which is where the 2% was established, right? Within the context of a 6-year interim period. So there's 6 years of this idea that we are going to cooperate between these this Sudan and the semi-autonomous region, right? And after the 6 years, they'll vote whether to stay together or separate. Abyei Protocol said that on the same day that the South Sudanese vote, the Ngok Dinka must also vote to decide if they go south or if they remain in the Sudan. What happened is they were denied that vote. And they've been denied that self-determination vote until this day. So that 2% should have definitely applied to the 6-year interim period. But now you have a situation where that 6-year interim period has turned into a 20-year interim period. And the oil has still been flowing every day. So the question is, what is the arrears or the entitlement legally by virtue of that agreement of the people of Abyei, the Ngok Dinka of Abyei, to that oil revenue? And we're talking about one of the poorest places on earth by all development indicators. If you look at the indicators of malnutrition, basically all of them, Abyei has consistently ranked, unfortunately and sadly, amongst the highest in the world. It's a protracted, continuous humanitarian crisis that has just been normalized, and people just live like that. And within that, you see resilience, which is something we can talk about as well. Now, I don't know if you want me to go back and say, well, it's not just Sudan and South Sudan. There's other international partners who actually they're also benefit.
Yeah, I do want you to do that, and I want you to if you can, because what I was about to ask you, number one, they didn't get the chance to vote, right? And I'm assuming, right, that denial primarily came from Bashir in the central government, right?
Yes. Yes.
But I want the audience, and if you could, just to speak so people understand. This was an internationally, a UN mediated agreement, which means that there was supposed to be some international intervention in ensuring that the vote would happen. And so whatever happened with that? How come, again, going back to where we started, Biden making these statements on behalf of the United States government. So where was the United Nations? Where were the international players that were part of this conflict with the United States? Again, I'm gonna focus because that's where we at. The United States was one of the main parties. So here we are now 20 years ahead. This vote still hasn't happened. The oil is still pumping, even in the midst of, as you were saying, even in the midst of this civil war, right? The oil production is still happening. So how is this being facilitated, brother? Who's minding the shop, and where are these resources?
Great question. And this Abyei really lets you peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, on how this international governance system really works in practice. First, to the credit of the US, and people will have different takes on what the geopolitical strategy was and kind of the vital interests motivating the foreign policy at that time, because now we're talking about the time of George W. Bush Jr. America took a very serious position on the brokering the peace in Sudan, and also supporting the independence of South Sudan when it came time to have to respect it. And basically, Bush told them that, either you're going to make peace or you will be our enemy, essentially. I mean, he used very tough terms to bring them to the negotiating table. And very effective, I would say, diplomacy through a guy named Senator Danforth, who was the envoy who really brokered the peace. Now, what that shows you, and the UN came in definitely to provide all types of complementary support, even in terms of capacity building of the security for a lot of things, right? But the fundamental driving force, right? If UN is multilateral, meaning many different states cooperating together in a multilateral framework, the US is unilateral, right? And the US unilateral position is what brought the bilateral agreement, meaning between the two countries, right? And then the UN brings in the multilateral, support. The US stepped out since Bush of taking Sudan or South Sudan seriously. And part of the reason, truthfully, is because there was so much enthusiasm in the independence of South Sudan and so much belief that this was going to lead to another great Western ally in Africa that would be prosperous and, live up to the ideals of this liberation. And when that didn't happen, when South Sudan actually entered into a period of what, the academics would probably call primitive accumulation that occurs in early state formation, which basically means snatch and grab whatever you can, right. Which is what has happened largely in South Sudan. I mean, the institutions could not support the dream of good governance. And it's still in that situation now, and we're struggling with that. There was such disappointment and disillusionment in the US, and some of the people who were the main champions actually became very scornful. And they just wanted to cut South Sudan off completely, and Sudan. And that kind of left Abyei, in as much as not only in principle, but in actually the letter of the agreements, the US was supposed to be the guarantor of the agreement. That's right. They were signatories to the agreement, you see, but they have largely absconded from that responsibility. The UN comes in, and there's actually a peacekeeping mission. One of the 11 peacekeeping missions, I believe, in the world is in Abyei, dedicated to Abyei, with a budget of over $1 billion a year, supporting about 4,000 soldiers, whose mandate is to keep peace in Abyei, which is, much more difficult than it sounds, right? And they will continue to basically provide whatever services they're able to, but they're not going to push the two governments to do anything. The UN does not push governments to do anything. Right. It's the US that pushes governments through the UN to do things. So unfortunately, the idea that the UN will bring people together, if they're not really interested in finding a solution, is not borne out in practice. It's the unilateral position of the US that forces the bilateral agreements between countries that the multilateral arrangements can then kick in to support. And that is what you call empire. And we've fallen off the radar. We've fallen off the radar in Abyei. Well, not because there's not reasons to take Abyei very seriously. And this goes to the question of who is getting the oil. Right. And some other questions that kind of revolve around that question of who is benefiting from the resources internationally and who is establishing a foothold in a very strategic part of Africa, the Horn of Africa, through business in Abyei. And the Misiria areas north of Abyei, where the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, General Hameti and his group are operating.
Well, speak to that if you can a little bit, Daniel. I think it's important that folks, at most we hear a lot about China, in the United States. There's just a whole ton of anti-Chinese propaganda that's put out there, by an assortment of Western interests. And sure enough, they're on the field, but they are not the only ones by far, right?
They are not the only ones. They are a significant
some of the other players, yeah.
So Chevron discovered oil in Abyei sometime in the 70s. And in fact, they discovered oil in the South as well and in other regions. And Chevron basically had the rights to production and exploration across the whole Sudan. There was a very, very strong play by Chevron and the United States on Sudan's oil in the 70s. And they invested a lot of money in developing the initial capacity to get up to production, which started in the late 90s, around 2000. And before they were able to get into the production, conflict started. Actually, conflict started in Abyei before this SPLA war of 1983. There was local conflict because already the government saw the tremendous value of Abyei's oil and started arming the Misriya as militias to depopulate the area. So this really started with the government trying to clear the way for the oil production with Chevron as a partner. Okay, I won't go to the extent of saying that Chevron knew or supported those actions, but I think the historians have a little bit of work to do to go back into the records and find out what really happened. Mm-hmm. Now, people started dying, bullets started flying, and Chevron felt compelled to disengage. And so it left a huge vacuum, partly because the data had already been collected. And it was clear that the survey showed significant recoverable oil in Abyei and South Sudan, and in come the Canadians, actually. There was a series of acquisitions of the rights to Abyei's oil and even all the oil of South Sudan that went through a few, in this oil business, people will get stuff cheap without the capacity to actually develop it fully or the interest, and they'll flip it to the big boys, right? So eventually the oil of Abyei got flipped to China. And China came in all across the South Sudan. Actually, the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, right, which is one of the 3 national oil companies of China, and the Malaysian national oil company called Petronas, and the Indian national oil company named ONGC. So essentially you have the 3 powerhouses of Asia, China, Malaysia, and India in the oil sector, forming a consortium to partner with the government of Sudan in production of the oil. And that's basically what's been going on for the whole history of Sudanese oil production, including in Abyei. Now, just to show you the juxtaposition between what I said earlier, which is that you can't find a single building built with the oil revenues from Abyei in Abyei itself. Mm-hmm. Now, in 2011, right, shortly before South Sudan became independent as a country, I was in China, in Beijing, and I was actually with some oil executives. And my concern was the same thing we're talking about now, which is how to make this thing right and how to set up a model in South Sudan where the oil could be managed in the spirit of what the liberation slogan said, which is that oil revenue will fuel the engine of agriculture as a front line of an integrated rural development that takes the town to the peoples in the villages so that the people in the villages don't have to flock to the towns where they'll be unemployed in slums. That is the words of Dr. John Garang, who is the leader of the SPLA, SPLM, and an agricultural economist, PhD from Iowa State, in addition to being the chairman of the liberation movement. And this was a slogan he put out. That has not happened. And I was in China at that time trying to help bring that about. And I was with a guy, a gentleman, who was one of the senior executives in the oil sector. And we were driving down the long street to Tiananmen Square, right across from what they call the Forbidden City, of where the emperor, the Chinese emperor used to be. And that street is amazing because you have all of these headquarters of major corporations, Chinese corporations, and ministries. And each one is like a marvel of architecture. When you move to Washington, D.C., where I was born, down in the Capital District, very impressive marble buildings and granite buildings. And, all of those buildings are so impressive, but they're all basically the same architecture. In China, every building is like its own architectural masterpiece on that long road to Tiananmen Square. And I was just marveling at, how majestic these buildings were. And the guy in his broken English leaned over to me while driving and said, "We built this with your oil money." You see? So that's that. That's what's going on. Can you blame the Chinese for participating in pure extraction? Well, that has to be discussed. If your governments are not responsible, and are not going to cut deals in the favor of the people, is it the responsibility of the Chinese to do it? It's a very interesting and I think not insignificant discussion as we look at the new kind of multipolar world that's emerging and how we're supposed to understand it and what we're supposed to expect from those that are considering themselves to be powers, in this multipolar world. So that I think is, in a nutshell, the story of Abyei's oil. Nothing has gone back to the people. It's been divided between elites in Juba and Khartoum and Beijing, and India and Malaysia, and no one is holding them to account. The UN is there in a peacekeeping mode, just facilitating and enabling the status quo to continue. And the US, who has been the sole arbiter of these type of things, is either not interested or their interests have been captured and hijacked by folks who couldn't really care less about the people of Abyei. Now, it does bring up, though, the fact that, in the absence of Western presence, the foothold for China and others, and even Russia, is growing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You see? And while Abyei may be an example of pure extraction, there are other examples where the Chinese, because the governments have told them that this is what we want, have invested massively in infrastructure. You see? And if the governments of either Sudan or South Sudan, and in the case of Abyei, it would have to be both of them, right, went to the Chinese and said, look, we've been taking the oil from this area for the last however many years. We need to build some highways between these countries. Mm-hmm. We need to build some industry. They would do it. And they would do it on concessional terms.
Folks know, like you mentioned, they have done it.
They've done it all over Africa. They're doing it, but it takes governments they respond to governments. That's their policy. The Western policy is we need to influence governments because governments are like children. Okay, I'm talking in very kind of crude terms, but that's what it is. I mean, let's be honest. That's how the West looks at African governments. You are children, and our responsibility is to guide you towards good governance, towards human rights, all these things that you don't know about inherently or indigenously. We need to guide you in that way. And if you do it, we'll give you some funds, for this or for that. But now the Chinese come and they say, look, you're grown-ups. You know what I mean? You handle your own business in your house and we can partner. So tell us what you want to do.
Yeah. All right, it's a lot more to break down on this, but I want to move to the other part because the time is running out on this. How do we get to where we want to go, brother? That's the first way. Starting with what exists, in Abyei, a vision of a new society, a new economy, if you could lay that out for us, and then let's kind of segment out that in the time we have remaining of in your mind and in your vision, what do you think is possible?
Right. All right, let me start off with a little metaphor that speaks to the concept of resilience, right? And resilience is something that is basically how we respond to tough situations, tough times, right? Technically, it would say how we respond to shocks and stressors. That could be conflict, that could be environmental shocks, climate change, that could be economic shocks. Whatever the shocks are, our capacity to respond and ideally adapt and innovate in the face of difficulty. That's resilience. And so I would say Abyei is a cauldron or a furnace in which different adaptations are fashioned, different forms of resilience are fashioned. And while there's pure extraction going on, there's also a lot going on at a community level in terms of exchange, in terms of trade, in terms of people trying, in the absence of state support, to make ends meet. And I think this is where what you said earlier, which is an intervention is needed around the gum Arabic, becomes really interesting. Because if we can start setting up the proto arrangements at a local level, right, capitalizing on that resilience and structuring it into organizational forms that work and demonstrate a proof of concept, then eventually, when things start stabilizing, which they will, we'll have the building blocks for very powerful alternative economic and political infrastructures that are being built from the bottom up. What does it take? I'm gonna tell you another story that I think was 2001. I went with USAID to a Misriya camp. Once again, these are the Black Arabs who inhabit the areas north of Abyei and who were armed by the government to depopulate Abyei. So basically nemesis type of relationship for quite a while. And we were called there because they heard that this delegation from USAID was in the area. And so this was just basically a clearing in the woods. It's an old village. Actually, funny enough, it's the village where my father was born. Now, there was a Misriya man, and he spoke to us. And he said, it was from this camp that the government of Sudan armed us and told us to take war into Dinka land. And our wives, and he pointed to some women who were there on the side. He said, our wives sang songs telling us not to come back unless we had the ear of a Dinka man. Yeah. And he said, and so we did it. And we took war into Dinka land because of what they promised us we would get. And he said, but look at us now. And he pointed to the same women. He said, our wives are drinking from hand-dug wells. And he pointed to the children who were sitting on a plastic sheet on the ground. He said, none of our kids go to school. And then he pointed to himself and the few men who were standing behind him. And he said, all of us are illiterate. He said, war has brought us nothing. And so we will be the ones to bring peace. And I found that very interesting because it's such an honest and such a real statement of what the factors are that either lead to conflict or cooperation. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we have to do locally and which we're working on and which we're doing is showing the added value of cooperation. That by working together across these lines, you can gain more than by being mobilized into conflict. That these conflicts that you're being mobilized into are serving interests that are never going to come back. And they never have come back. And it's becoming intergenerational, right? And so what you find is that a peace started between these two communities. And it was interesting because that spirit led to the chiefs meeting. And at that meeting, I told you the Misriya are natural traders. And so one guy brought a bag of rice and he sold it to the Dinka at that peace meeting. And he saw that there's a market. The next peace meeting bought a bunch of bags. And out of those peace negotiations, a market developed called the Amiet market, which within a year, there were 5,000 stalls, people coming from all over because of this little space, because of local arrangements that had nothing to do with government, community-based arrangements to not fight, but to cooperate. All of a sudden you have a market growing in the midst of this no man's land. Okay, so I believe that we need to bring in our more, I would call it advanced forms of organization, like cooperatives and the things that you've been working on, bring it as a support to these communities with whatever capital can be mustered to get them started on developing the gum Arabic, transforming the cattle sector from one which is now highly militarized, where you have militias raiding each other's cattle, right, to actually trade. So from raiding to trading. You see, and this is why I'm saying this discussion, we're not dealing with ideology, right, or economic theory. We're dealing with the very practical systems of incentives that structure exchange, right? And then how you can, at a very local level, introduce the governance, and the distribution systems that could be scaled in the future. So that's what I'll say. I think that's the level that we need to focus on. Yes, these are areas of conflict. And I'm speaking also for Sudan. Abyei is just an early example of what now many communities in Sudan are having to face, which is how do you exist? How do you maintain resilience in a state of conflict and in relation to fragile states that aren't able to discharge their state responsibility? It's in these cauldrons, these furnaces, where we can help to engineer adaptations, which may be very significant in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it what's the status of this meat market now? You know,
Amyet market is functioning. It's
okay.
functioning. It's a lot of business goes through it. It's a corridor between North and South. Abyei is a natural trading point between, so in times of peace, people move through Abyei. All types of things are going through Abyei. I would say it's probably like the early, probably boom towns on the frontier, where a lot of wealth is being created, a lot of, but also very chaotic. Mm-hmm. At times there's a step backward in order to take a step forward. Militias can target and be involved, but at the same time, economy still goes on. I mean, I think this is a whole nother discussion, but in relation to the fact that economics is not necessarily predicated on peace, governance, and all of that, or a state being functional. Somalia is a very good example of how people can organize themselves and even build wealth, right? The Somalis are becoming very wealthy, even without having solved the issue of the central state.
Good, definite conversation to have. So I want us to go about 10 more minutes, Daniel. Then we want to open this up for questions because I'm in time. I'm sitting there looking at the time. We're barely scratching the surface. I think it's been a good conversation. But so if you can, lay out a vision for yourself about how to leverage some of the natural resources, right? And like superfoods as a critical piece towards the development of Abyei. And then, if you can touch on a little bit, like what role could we play, right? Those in this listening audience, the international audience, what could we do potentially to kind of help intervene and develop this in a way that's going to be equitable and go directly, to the people in the community to guide and move as they deem necessary.
Yeah. So I like the fact that you mentioned superfoods. It's another area that we didn't talk about, which is that in addition to the gum, there are indigenous trees across the entire land of Abyei, the forest, that produce foods which are traditionally fruits and berries and roots and other things, which are traditionally used as food supplements. Some of them are highly medicinal and are actually medicines. Others are just very powerful nutritional, sources of nutrition. And these are things which are indigenous to the area and that people internationally may not even know about. But not only are they critical for, and actually when we've done the research, we've done quite a bit of research on different things. One of the things was we were trying to look at, in times of hunger, where do people look to survive? Do they look to the UN, to the agencies, to who? Who's providing support? They look to the forest. So these are actually a very important mainstay of resilience in the face of food insecurity. These could also become industries. Some of these foods are so valuable, even internationally marketed and studied. They could be serious sources of collaboration, of value addition, of products coming from Abyei. So that's on the food stuff. Now, in terms of how we approach organizing so that some of these opportunities can actually be brought to bear. We looked at models from across the world of community trusts. And amongst the models that we looked at, there were some which were very interesting. There's an Ingonyama Trust in South Africa. And, part of that, that's the Zulu Trust. And it's a trust that basically controls Zululand. Now, there's a lot to be desired in terms of that model. So if you go and like research it, you'll see a lot of politics and stuff involved. But just the idea that a community trust could claim governance rights over an entire communal land and incorporate it so that it is recognized by law and has the capacity to relate both to the market and to the state. The Zulu Ingonyama Trust is quite interesting. There's the Maori Trust in New Zealand, where the Maori people have used trust models to support business in many different ways. And there's many trusts that they're almost a trust incubator. In Alaska, they have the Alaska Permanent Fund. Why the Alaska Permanent Fund is interesting is because it's dealing with oil revenues from public lands and national parks in Alaska. And what happens is that each year, the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is now tremendously wealthy in terms of capital, makes a distribution. And a certain amount is given to every citizen, Alaskan citizen, in terms of a dividend on the oil. A certain amount is invested in a corporation where they can do investments. And then a certain amount is given to the state if necessary to cover gaps in state budget. Okay. And it's governed by a board of trustees. And when we're looking at it, really that's what a tribe is. A tribe is a trusteeship over land. And the chiefs and the council of elders are really a board of trustees. The difference is that it's not legally incorporated. So the idea was, what would an indigenously generated community trust model look like in Abyei, right? And so we proceeded to, with actually support from the US Institute of Peace that gave the funding for a series of trainings and workshops, we started unpacking with the community. First of all, what are the key community institutions who are the stakeholders? Everything from the religious to the chiefs, to the local government, to the women's union, to the youth league. They mapped out 17 different community institutions. And then they brought delegates from each of these institutions. And then they formed the Abyei Fund for Resilience and Development, a FORD, with a General Assembly and a Board of Trustees of 11 members, chaired by the Paramount Chief, you see. So this entity actually has the legal right to go after, first of all, its arrears, the oil money that's been owed to it, which I think is a very important long-term strategic objective, and also to represent the community in any future arrangements. But in the immediate, to also begin looking at how to organize the youth, right? And how to help them become productive, how to help them access partnerships and capital, and how to help them form cooperatives. In relation to the gum Arabic, to the cattle, to the business that's going through Amiet Market, to all types of opportunities that are out there, starting with, and this is where I think the technology side of it becomes so interesting. When I was last few weeks ago at a conference in Kilifi, Kenya, called Vernacular Humanitarianism, that was what they were calling it, which is basically mutual aid, essentially. We were seeing the Somalia case studies. And the way these folks are using WhatsApp groups and crowdfunding, right? Tapping into their clan-based social networks in order to raise funds for specific purposes, starting with emergency response and care for one another, but then moving over into investments, social impact funding crowdsourced from the diaspora. You see, this is another area where, with things like Starlink now, being able to bring internet to even the most remote areas, right? You can imagine just a couple of years ago last year, to get a internet access in Abyei would have cost you $5,000 a month, right? To maintain a VSAT. Yeah, to maintain a VSAT. Now, with Starlink, you can set the whole thing up for less than $500 and pay $50 a month and create a wireless signal where the whole village can have access to internet. So we're in a time where technology is drastically transforming the playing field, right? And what that means is locally, you have the ability to connect globally, right? Starting with your own diaspora who's already primed to support, right? And has kinship obligations based on the local culture and clan-based systems. But if you can get, say, the venture capital or angel funding or underwriting of certain initiatives, like say GUM, cooperative, internally, then you can partner with the co-op Jacksons. You know what I mean? You can partner with the solidarity economy. You can partner with folks that want to see not only you succeed, but also want to align their own interests with yours, you know, in a very practical way. And while we're not dealing with ideology or economic theory, I think as you build out those systems, we'll actually see an alternative to what we call capitalism, the pure extraction and exploitation being evolved from the ground up.
Much more to build on there. I want to just out of respect to everybody who's been listening, I want to open it up in the time we have remaining to see if there's any questions. You can put your questions in the chat, and we will pick them up directly from there. But thank you for that, Daniel.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the floor is open, everybody, you know, for some questions in the time we have remaining. I'll ask another one while folks are formulating some stuff, Daniel. The one of the critical this is me thinking with my Cooperation Jackson hat on. So let me qualify that, and it may be a technical term, but there's some deeper political aspects to it. And so the pieces you're talking about, setting up like this trust, right, and then integrating, you know, making, you know, like a basic investment, you know, through the use of the technology to kind of set this up. What would be some of the limitations, or how will we, let me put it this way, how would we overcome the limitations of being able to facilitate international trade given the nature of the conflict right now, right?
Yeah.
You know, because you know, you know, we've worked on a little project with Debt Crow, and we kind of, you know, just helped facilitate some things and tried to learn. I think we've learned a lot from that. But that's one of the key areas that I know from sitting down was like, well, how could we move this further? You know, what would be the steps? You know, and for folks to understand what I mean by that, you know, you know, disputed international territory. You know, things would have to move across an international line. You know, and whatever their tariffs, you know, or import restrictions may or may not be, then their port of exit in terms of, you know, trying to get something, say here, you know, to Mississippi, right? And then all the chains that got to go, you know, through it. And we want to make sure, you know, just for the audience, you know, to know how the limitations. I want to be able to make sure that in our trade, the producers, right, and the manufacturers, the farmers, in Abyei get their just rewards, and they're not extracted from along the way, you know, by maybe say a South Sudanese tariff or a Kenyan tariff to get to the, you know, the port of Mombasa, and then some crazy export, you know, or excuse me, import, you know, fee that we have to pay on that end, because that means, you know, you reduce what is actually paid at the source, and then we would have to do a, you know, on the norm if we can't figure out a tremendous markup, which then makes it, you know, highly impractical to do something, you know, maybe to scale or cut something like us, which is small, out. So, you know, what are your initial thoughts on how we might overcome some of these challenges? You know, just briefly.
Yeah. I think, first of all, it's a great question, and it opens up a lot of very kind of granular lines of strategy and tactics that, if not attended to carefully, would mean such a venture wouldn't work, right? These are serious questions. I would kind of bucket them into a few different categories, right? The first is just the pure logistics of moving stuff from Abyei, which is a deep interior landlocked area in a bad neighborhood, essentially, and bad only in the sense that the governments are not helping out, so to speak, on both sides. How do you actually get that to the markets? How do you get stuff to the markets? And so that's a question of logistics. I think on that one, my experience is that human beings must be water-based creatures. They say that we're like 70% water, right? Because just like water flows and finds its way to the ocean, human beings will find their way, you know what I mean, logistically, to get products to market. And that's part of the resilience. So I think the actual physical movement of stuff, even though the infrastructure is difficult, you know, the road infrastructure and all of that, people will find the way if the market is there, and if the investment to get it started is there. The middle path, meaning the path in the middle to the, whether it's all the way to the market or to a port, like say the port of Lamu in Kenya, they'll figure that part out. And they'll also figure out how to reduce costs on the way, despite whatever might be out there, right? So that's one question. But the second question is really about more of kind of a policy question and a strategy question. The first question, which is more policy, is like, okay, what do you produce and for whom, right? And I think the policy has to be, you produce what you need first for your own people. So for example, the first order of business is to cater to the food security needs of the local population, right? And then you can trade surplus. So that's one way to look at it. The second would be to say value addition, right? Target products that are of high value for export markets, right? Put as much value addition as possible within country, and then get the finished products, which would reduce the bulk that you'd have to move, and would also ensure that you're not dealing with the actual base of the production system, which would still be for the local population, but it's more high-end products that are more, I would almost say, cultural goods, that part of the purpose of the trade is to build relations. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? More like the ancient concepts of trade, where it's just as much about solidarity and interaction as it is about profit, right? And so that would mean that those on the other side would have to really, it's not just your average capitalist. You'd need someone who really sees the vision and is willing, maybe even in the short term, not to get too much profit, right? To delay until it's scaled, but to set up a model that works, you know? So there will have to be that aspect of commitment to building something new. I would say that there's also the issue of engaging with governments to create the most advantageous system of licensing and trade and, you know, tariffs, and basically benefiting from things like AGOA, you know, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, doing some lobbying with some folks in the States, you know, Prosper Africa, because they can significantly support trade if they want to, if that's in the interest. And I think there would definitely have to be a component of getting this as a strategic foreign policy that is of interest to the US. And I believe it can be done. I mean, I believe that there is a strong argument that these models, when you start bringing to scale, are very important for the future of the US, because we need to reinvent how we engage with the world.
Right.
You know?
I got one question here, two questions really, and I think one of the parts have been answered, but to go in more detail, Daniel. Are there any clean energy co-op projects moving? Is that direly needed in villages in need of electricity and light for children to learn, etc.? And then there was a question, kind of a follow-up there. Can folks trade and buy goods with Sudan right now?
Yeah. I would say that there's a lot of projects that go on through kind of the humanitarian and development aid funding that goes into these countries. A lot of them are community based. There's an increasing understanding that, they talk about localization, community driven projects, renewables. So I think what we'd find is that at a project level, there's a lot of interesting things going on, but nothing that I've seen which is really taking it to its full potential in terms of transformative impacts. And I think it's time for that. It's time for that, especially on the energy side, because obviously the energy is what fuels the industry. The cottage industries are something very interesting to look at, and this is all about leapfrogging.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent can we create a powerful distributed production capacity based on renewable energy? I think that's a design challenge that those who figure it out will be able to scale it, because essentially that's what we need. So I would say there's prototypes and examples out there of people experimenting with a lot of interesting stuff, and there's a lot of opportunity to pull those things together into different designs. In terms of trade, my understanding of Sudan and South Sudan is that much of the trade limitations or the sanctions are on individuals, right? Politically exposed individuals, and not so much on the country as a whole. The problem is that the banking sector, they tend to simplify a country like Sudan and just say, we're not dealing with it. So financial transfers become difficult, especially to Sudan. And South Sudan, because we have the name Sudan in our country, right? The banking system actually automatically blocks transactions using an algorithm. So you have to call in and explain and get, so yeah, the financial transactions and transfers technically shouldn't be a problem for what they call politically exposed persons or designated individuals on their list. But in practice, there can be challenges.
Well, I want to give you the last parting words, Brother Daniel. Just anything you'd like to conclude with in the last couple of minutes we got, and I'll just give some updates to close us out on where we're going from here with the series.
Yeah, the first thing is, I guess there's two things. The first is just that, in crisis, there's opportunity. That's something that my father, if I didn't mention that's one of his favorite slogans. If he watches this, he's gonna hold me to task on that. So I gotta give a shout out to Pops. In crisis, there's opportunity. And I've seen that for real. I think the hard situations and circumstances that people face in Abyei and across South Sudan and Sudan and the entire region are actually environments that forge resilience. And that resilience is a very real capacity. It's something that can be tapped into and leveraged. And when that resilience starts translating into people deciding to work together out of an understanding that conflict brings nothing, like what that Miseria man shared with us, it forms a very powerful basis for economic exchange. And that economic exchange can actually be taken to great heights, even without a functioning state. And even within an environment where from time to time, there's conflict that you have to factor in. And these are extremely rich communities inherently. The question is, how do you help to capitalize on that endowment, that blessing, those resources? And how do you do it in a way that also sits upon the indigenous systems of reciprocity and sharing that are still very strong in these communities? And this is why I brought up the Somali situation. I would recommend that everyone on this call look again at Somalia, not through the lens of the way in which the state collapsed and the conflicts and the tribalism has been framed through the media, but really understand how resilient the Somali people are and how they're actually emerging out of that cauldron in a way that is going to be a force to be reckoned with. You know, the Somali people. We have a lot to learn from them. So I would say that is the first thing in understanding these locations, seeing beyond what is just presented to us in the media, or what just seems to be intuitive in the sense of conflict is bad, you know, these are poor areas, but look a little deeper. And then to just thank you for even having the heart and the mind to invite this question of how do we build that solidarity? How do we build the solidarity economy in a way that connects these spaces, Jackson, Mississippi, and Abyei? I think it's a beautiful question. I think it's a tough question, but it's a question worth asking. And it's a question that I'm committed to finding the answer to.
We want to appreciate you, Brother Daniel, for the time and you know, sharing your perspective, the history, the knowledge, deeper understanding of the culture, you know, to break the silence, intentional silence on these issues, you know, for a general U.S. audience. I hope everybody, you know, took a lot from it, were well fed, left with many things to think about and to act upon, you know, because there's a ton of work we got to do on this. And just to let everybody know, we're going to do 2 more sessions about this question of revolution and counter-revolution in the Sudan, because I think as this series has clearly demonstrated, there is a lot to learn from what is going on and how people are, you know, making their way out of no way, basically. So the next session was going to be specifically about the Darfur region and how that is been playing out in some of its history and what's going on there. And then the final one, we're going to try to bring hopefully Daniel and some of the prior guests back on to have a you know, kind of a facilitated discussion about how do folks see things going forward, and maybe what are some of the things, you know, those of us, you know, who are committed internationalists, anti-imperialists, what we can do, you know, to support this move towards peace, right? What we can do to help facilitate that in our communities and build, you know, at least make some connections and links to the social movements we are all involved in to bring something to bear on this. So be on the lookout for that in October and November. And we're also going to do some extra sessions, one about climate change in Senegal and some of the changes that are taking place there and throughout the Sahel region. We're going to have a couple of folks from there and from Burkina Faso who are going to be joining us for that. And then look for, you know, in December, we're going to do a session about the colonial situation in West Papua New Guinea, which is also, you know, not highly discussed or talked about at all in the United States, but it's very critical to understand a lot of what's going on in the world, particularly as we talk about trade and some of the conflicts that are intensifying, you know, in Asia and over in the South Pacific region that have a you know, critical impact on all of us. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all for joining us and talk to everybody soon.
Thank you, Kali. Salute.
All right. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.